The dawn of a new day in human relations, why men wage war on each other, and how to prevent it. Addressed by Dr. Walter Russell at Portsmouth, Virginia, Armed Forces Day celebration, in front of highly ranked members of the U.S. military, May 19, 1951. The world is our stage, and every man plays his role in the great cosmic drama. Each player is of vital and equal importance in the whole play of creation. Life itself is our great teacher. Through trial and error, we learn what to do and what not to do. That is why the seemingly hard experiences teach us more than the happy, easy ones. When we learn to face ourselves and analyze our weak points, then we begin to make real progress. On such a great day as this, when the armed forces which protect us from our enemies get together to remind each other that we still have enemies who are eager to kill us, it is appropriate to ask ourselves, why do we still have enemies who wish to kill us? Why is it that these splendid men of the armed forces of the United States have to go out into the world and be killed or horribly maimed for life by those who hate us? Why the agonies of war, the terrors of wholesale killings, the grief of kindly mothers? Why? Why? What is the matter with our human relations which keeps us from living together in brotherly goodwill, friendly neighborliness, and happiness? Why do we have enemies? We cannot understand the faults of the whole human race by looking at only one generation of it. So let us go back to the beginnings of man and look at the whole human race squarely in the face. By doing so, we will find the cause of all wars. First great lesson. For millions of years, man lived the life of the wild animal of the jungle. During those long ages, he had but one law, the law of self-survival, which he enforced with the brute power of might. He did not know right from wrong. He had no conscience or consciousness. He did not even think. He took what he wanted to satisfy his own greed. He killed without compunction or regret when he wanted anything. He made every man fear him, and he feared every man. During that period, he began to learn his first great lesson, that whatsoever he gave to other men, he got back in kind. That is the way man began. He made every man his enemy, because he was every man's enemy. Gradually, men grouped into herds, and herds into nations, and for each other's protection. For long ages, tribes attacked other tribes, killing those whom they could not use, and making slaves and concubines of the others. Then came the dawn of conscience in man. He began to think. That was only a few thousand years ago. Think of it, millions of years of killing and bloodshed in the jungle, and only about 10,000 years out of it. Those millions of years of bloodlust could not be forgotten and put aside. Nature does not work that way. Nature unfolds slowly. The age of idolatry comes with the first suspicion of a supreme being. Blood sacrifices were made to appease their god of wrath. Thousands upon thousands of bullocks and sheep were slain upon the very altars of their temples, even until after the time of Christ. They also sacrificed their own children to appease their gods. Bloodlust and cruelty persisted for many centuries. Gladiators killed each other by the hundreds for the pleasure of the people of Rome, and mothers took their children to the arenas to see lions tear human beings apart, just as we take our children to the circus today. The beginning of empire building. Now let us leap ahead and see how the world looked in the year 1910, only 40 years ago. The world was then divided into empires, which had all been built by the jungle methods of might over right. All were built up through bloodshed and conquest, just as the ancient empires were built. Great Britain was a great and powerful empire in 1910. She ruled the seas and many great nations like India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and had other strongholds in countries which she had exploited, such as China. She was rich and prosperous beyond measure. Her titled class owned great estates, and her power was seemingly invulnerable. Today, England is on rations, her empire breaking up, her bloodlust being killed, her titled class becoming impoverished, and their great estates disappearing. India and Egypt have revolted, and England's splendid morale so lowered that her power is at a low ebb. All of this within 40 years. Why? Because her enemies all rose up against her and smote her. Why did England have enemies smite her? Because England was the enemy of other countries. The United States was also rich and powerful. Its culture was at a high standard. It had built a great empire which had reached from coast to coast. It had no income tax, and no youth worried about conscription, and mothers had no worries about such a possibility. Today, the United States is in debt for hundreds of billions. Incomes are taxed to almost confiscation point, and hundreds of thousands of our best blood have been killed. Its young men are being called to war, and mothers who have before known war's agonies are again preparing to face them. All of this in 40 years. Why? Because her enemies rose up against her to smite her. Why did the United States have enemies to smite her? Because she made enemies by being the enemy of other men. Consider France, the world's center of art, with its great African and Indo-Chinese empire. Austria, the world music center. Holland, with its East Indies. Belgium, with its Congo wealth. Germany, Italy, Tsarist Russia, and other countries which were powerful 40 years ago. Where are these mighty empires today? Impoverished, all of them. Millions of their best blood have been killed, millions more maimed and crippled, morale almost gone. All of them infiltrated with traitors, spies, and fifth column saboteurs. All of them, the world over. All of this agony in 40 years. Why? Because their enemies rose up and smote them. Why did all of these countries have enemies to smite them? Because they were the enemies of all other men. Let us return to the beginning. Now we will return to the beginning of civilization again. Tribes grew into nations and empires by the inherited jungle methods of killing, robbing, and enslaving. Read your history of early man. Read how Babylon, Byzantium, Macedonia, Sparta, Greece, and Rome rose and fell through cruelty and slaughter. Read in your Bible how tribes slaughtered tribes, robbed them of their treasures, and made slaves and concubines of their women. Then read how these conquering tribes were in turn conquered and slaughtered by the enemies they had themselves made. Let us look at our own nation face to face. How did we build our empire from the handful of pioneers who landed here about 500 years ago? We gradually killed the entire race of Indians which we found here and kidnapped thousands of Africans to enslave, just as our savage ancestors did ages ago. We fought over 100 wars and killed hundreds of thousands of people whom we made our enemies by being their enemies. That is the way we built our empire. We live by the sword, and now seem very much astonished that we are threatened with death by the sword. We made every man our enemy, and now wonder why we should have enemies. We violated God's law by robbing and killing to gain happiness and prosperity for ourselves, but taking away the happiness and prosperity of others. All empires were built that way, all in strict violation of God's law of love. All of them took what they wanted by the power of might over right, just as our ancestors of the jungle did. And all of them prayed fervently to God for conquest over their enemies, as the early tribes of Bible history prayed to God for power to smite their enemies. God's law always works. Whatever seed you sow, you harvest in kind, multiplied by 100. Every nation made enemies by being enemies. We fear man today because we made man fear us yesterday. We made Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin that way. Yes, it was we that made these monsters by creating the conditions which bred them. Hitler tried to build an empire by the sword and died by that same sword. Mussolini tried it and committed his people to untold suffering. Stalin is trying to enslave not only the rest of the world, but his own people. Stalin is reaching farther toward the unnatural than any tribe or nation in history, for they enslaved others for their own tribe's benefit, while Stalin is attempting to enslave the whole world for his own benefit. God's law will not allow him to do that. He will die by his own sword, as Hitler and Mussolini died. Second great lesson. Slowly civilizing man was at the beginning of learning his second great lesson, which is that no man can prosper and find peace through destroying the peace and happiness of others. Man had not yet begun to learn another great lesson of life, which is that no man can hurt another without hurting himself and the whole world. Early man thus built a world of fear and hatred. He drew boundary lines around his tribes, which slowly grew to be nations. Every man and nation feared every other man and nation. That is the kind of world early man built as his remembrance of the jungle, and that is the kind of world we are inheriting today from our primate ancestors. We are still building a world of hate and fear, for we are still barbarians, and will be so long as we kill our fellow men. Today as yesterday, every man fears every other man, and every nation fears every other nation. Every man locks his doors at night for fear of his neighbor. We police our streets for fear of other men, and nations carry heavy armaments to slaughter their neighbors or to resist being slaughtered by them. Is it any wonder that there is war, and still more war? Every empire on earth has tried to build peace and prosperity for itself by taking away the peace and prosperity of others. And one class of people has tried to find security and peace for itself by destroying the security and peace of the other class. Nations have lived by the sword and have died by the sword, and as long as they persist in killing their neighbors, they will be killed by their neighbors. There is not one innocent nation on earth. All of them have been the enemies of all the others. All have been aggressors and exploiters of others. All have lived for self and for greed, and all have practiced the power of might over right to build their empires. Why do we have such human monsters as Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin? We have them because we have made them. We could not help having them. I will tell you how it happened. The greatest war in history. Human beings the world over divided themselves into two opposite classes and went to war with each other within their own countries. These two enemies were the upper class and the lower class. The upper class exploited the lower class to get all it could for itself and give as little as possible to the lower class. The two classes were kings and subjects, nobility and serfs, capital and labor, rich and poor, owner and laborer. The upper class gained riches and security for itself by destroying the riches and security of the lower class. Gradually, this division of man became the greatest war in all history, for fear was multiplied by this war of man against man, this war of exploitation of man by man. The worker half of the world feared security for his family, while the exploiting half had everything. He had the money. He was the owner. The laborer could be hired and fired at will. He was lucky to have a job at starvation wages. Gradually, the pendulum began to swing the other way. The enemies the upper class had made began to rise up against them to smite them. And that is the war we are fighting today. It is not a war of nations for each other's lands. It is a world war of the underprivileged, long-suffering lower class against the upper class. That is what world communism is. The slave of the landowner now wishes to destroy the landowner and take his lands for himself. Here in America, a better form of communism came into being through the vision and wisdom of great and free Americans who began to realize the mutual interdependence of capital and labor. Industry realized that labor could be the best customer of its products if the laborer were given more money to buy those products and more leisure to spend it. Wages were drastically raised and hours were shortened to make the poor man rich enough to buy the products of the upper class, for there were not enough of the rich to buy their own products. The tide began to turn. The standard of living of the lower class began to leap higher and higher. Every farmer and laborer had a car, a washing machine, and power machines to lighten the labor of both men and women. Harmony was on the way. The rising standard of living in the United States made the American workman pour food for the arguments of communist dictators, whose millions of followers were responding to the call of the land serf to destroy the landlord and take his lands away from him. Harmony was on the way in this country, but not in the rest of the big starving world of the very rich and the very poor. It touched too little of the world. While every laborer in this country owned a car, dread squalor existed in other parts of the world. The movement was too slow, too little, and too late for the yeast of prosperity and the workmen of this country to leaven the whole loaf. Lack of security, hunger, and fear for tomorrow bred the seeds of fascism, Nazism, and communism in millions upon millions of the underprivileged who were made to hate the upper class because of fear for their daily bread. In this condition lies the power of dictators who make promises which they never intend to fulfill as bait for the starved ones. The workers find that they have but exchanged 10,000 masters for one. They find themselves still enslaved, still poor, and still afraid. When they at last find that out, they turn like wolves and rend their new master to pieces. Stalin's destroyer is behind the Iron Curtain. We should reach our hands out to him and let him know that we are coming to liberate him. The only remedy for wars. The only remedy for stopping wars is to entirely reverse the old selfish and greedy basis upon which human relations of the past have been built and substitute the golden rule basis of equal interchange in all transactions between men. Hate and fear have dominated human relations. Brotherly love and the unity of man must replace our primate practices. Mankind has a great new lesson to learn, which is that nature never takes anything. Nature only gives for regiving. That is the secret of nature's continuance. When man learns the love principle upon which God founded his universe, the growth of man toward prosperity, peace, and happiness will be as continuous as the continuity of solar systems. The earth gives all it has of forests, crops, and vapors to the heavens, and the heavens give them all back again to earth for regiving, over and over, forever. Man has tried to perpetuate himself by taking instead of giving, and has destroyed his civilizations over and over again for ages, and is on the way to again destroying his world. You cannot take happiness away from another for yourself. You can only give happiness to find it for yourself. Likewise, you cannot take love. You can only give love. That is the next great lesson which mankind must eventually learn. That is the lesson of the brotherhood of man, which the spiritual messengers of the last 3,000 years have given to their people. Lao Tzu and Confucius gave it to the Chinese. Buddha told it to the Hindus. Mohammed told it to the Arabians. The unknown mystic who wrote the Bhagavad Gita told it to the Persians. And God's beloved Son Jesus, the greatest of all the illumined, gave it to the world. Jesus said, "Love ye one another, and do ye unto one another as ye would have them do unto you." But few since that day have known what he meant, or have practiced it in their daily lives. The people of the world have never understood that the golden rule was law, which must be obeyed as much as the law of gravity must be obeyed. Else it would break one as surely as though one threw himself over a cliff in defiance of the law of gravity. People considered it just an ideal for practice in close family and social relations, but not for business dealings. No one had discovered that the law of equal interchange between all pairs of opposites in human relations demanded the same equality as those in nature. Just as the piston stroke of compression must equal the expansion stroke in an engine or in one's heartbeat, so must that which every man receives from another man or from nature be equaled by what he gives. When you do thus give love, the law gives it back to you in equal measure, as surely as the giving of vapors to the heavens is regiven as rain to the earth. The underlying principle of the whole universe is balanced mutual service, service given for service received. When the whole world practices the giving of service first instead of taking first, wars will be impossible between nations or between any pair of opposites, like capital and labor, buyer and seller, husband and wife, or government and people. If, for example, a manufacturer desires prosperity, he must first give prosperity by going out into his factories and seeing to it that those who are working for his enrichment are themselves made prosperous. That is the way the law of equal interchange works, and the golden rule is that law. It has not been practiced that way, however, for the manufacturer has considered that his prosperity came from his customers, so he hired labor as cheaply as possible and gave to the workmen as little as possible. That policy has been the most expensive policy in history. Out of the suppression of man by man grew the ideologies about which we are now fighting. We are not fighting to expand national boundaries primarily as in the past. We are fighting fanatical hate generated for ages by the suppression of one half of mankind by the other half. In other words, we are fighting because of the old selfishness and greed which began in the jungle and is still destroying us. People still want what they want and go after it no matter how it hurts themselves or their neighbors. Witness, for example, the self-made war which is taking place between our own people within our own borders, which is the result of selfishness and greed. Think of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who want to get rich quickly and gamble in the hope of getting rich quickly. This breed of selfishness and greed has developed within our borders a powerful gangster enemy which reaches its talons into every department of our lives and hurts every man, woman, and child in America. Selfishness and greed of the gambling public is undermining our very government and will eventually destroy us if we do not check it. Billions of dollars have bought protection for gangsters by bribing millions of public service officials, from petty sheriffs and policemen to mayors and even governors. Then there is another war, which many more Americans have bred within their own borders because of selfishness and greed. The black market is war. It is a war of the people who want what they want and go after it, no matter how it hurts themselves and every other person in the country. Inflation is war, started by the hoarding of people who are afraid they cannot get what they want when they want it, and are going to make sure of theirs now, no matter how it hurts the whole nation. That is what I mean when I say that God's law of balanced interchange always works. If you work with the law, it will work with you to fulfill your desire, but if you work against that law, it will as surely break you as that fire will burn you. We made our own wars in past ages because of selfishness and greed. We are still making our own wars because of selfishness and greed, and the whole world of men is still suffering, bleeding, and dying because of selfishness and greed. How can we stop wars? Wars can stop only when we stop making them, and we shall stop making them only when we learn the great lesson of the unity of man, and the fact that other men are not only brothers, but are actually ourselves. When we learn that lesson, we will know that we cannot hurt any other man without hurting ourselves in the same measure. You, as an individual, can stop all wars by stopping them in your home, your town, and your whole sphere of influence. Unity begins in the home, then reaches out to your neighborhood. If every man in the world who desires prosperity, happiness, and peace gives love out from himself to his home and his neighborhood, there would be no more wars. For war is the harvest of hate and fear, while happiness and peace are the fruits of love. The world is now due for the greatest transformation of man in all history. It may be that we still need the great punishment of another world war to chasten us into greater understanding of our relationship to our fellow man. But if another war is the cost of that knowledge of the unity of man and causes him at long last to practice the golden rule in every thought and action, it will be worth it. Man must someday learn to serve his fellow man with full knowledge that in so doing he is serving all men. When that day comes, the world of men will then know the real prosperity, happiness, and peace which love alone will give to men. Epilogue. Wrong concepts of what constitutes wealth and power have not only wrecked civilizations, nations, and individuals, but are continuing to wreck them. As long as man's concept of wealth and power is a material one, based upon requirements and desires of the body, just so long will man make the gratification of his senses of paramount importance in the building of an environment for his body, rather than for the enrichment of his soul. This coming new age will alter man's concepts of values, and a new civilization will arise from that change. Science and religion are the two most important elements of man's civilization. The two are opposite phases of the same thing, but have pulled apart for centuries. To bring them together in a marriage of complete mutual cooperation and understanding would vastly uplift the whole human race. To accomplish this purpose, a scientific foundation is needed for religion, and a spiritual foundation is needed for science. The most important and noble attribute of man is character.
None for you and none for all.
Are you a sentient being, or just a machine? Are you a sentient being, or just a machine? Are you a sentient being, or just a machine? Are you a sentient being, or just a machine? Or just a machine?